Welcome once again to the Civitas poll presentation, this one for November 2021. My name is Mitch Kokai. I'm Senior Political Analyst at the John Locke Foundation, sitting in this time for Locke President Donald Bryson. And our expert analyst and commentator this time around, Dr. Andrew Taylor, Professor of Political Science at NC State University, no stranger to the Civitas poll presentation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Lots of interesting stuff in this poll, so we're going to
Yes.
go ahead and get to it and also tell you a little bit of information about how you can play a part if you would like to ask some questions. So first of all, we're going to tell you a little bit about the methodology of the Civitas poll this time around. This was a statewide survey conducted November 12th through the 14th, so fairly recently, with 600 likely 2022 general election voters. It has a margin of error of plus or minus 4%, so that means anything within 4%, you have to kind of figure it could go either way. Known registered voters were interviewed via live phones, SMS, and email invitation. The survey was weighted to a likely 2022 general election voter universe. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how you can participate on Twitter if you'd like to take part in our discussion of the Civitas poll. You can tweet to the John Locke Foundation at John Locke NC. You can tweet to me at my name, Mitch Kokai, or a more complicated one for Dr. Taylor. You could tweet at AJTFOSP, or you can search for him.
Yeah, that's the Free and Open Societies Project, which I direct. Unfortunately, I have a name that's a bit more common than Mitch Kokai, so Andy Taylor was already taken.
That's right, especially in this state.
Yes.
If you'd like to tweet at the pollsters, the Signal poll, it is at Signal, CYGNAL. And please hashtag Civitas poll if you're going to write about the poll information. So right now we're going to talk about some of the questions that have to do with the electoral environment. These are some of the things that we talk about quite a bit when we do the Civitas poll. And first of all, we're going to get to the right direction, wrong track question. The question was, generally speaking, would you say things in the United States are headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track? Wrong track continues to gain. Bad news, we see from the slide, 65% of voters think we're on the wrong track. That was up 2% from our last poll. Those who think we're in the right direction, 29%. When you see that, what does that say to you?
Yeah, it's interesting because we have been used to, over the past couple of decades really, people being cynical about the future, being rather pessimistic about the way things are going, regardless of the actual state of affairs, the state of the economy. One would think that as we sort of accelerate out of the coronavirus pandemic, that people will be getting a bit more optimistic, just generally, regardless of the political situation. And that clearly isn't the case. It's hard to know what that is, whether it's sort of this pervasive cynicism we have. Maybe it's things that the economy isn't doing as well as people think. People are concerned about inflation, etc. But you would think it would be better than it is. And the wrong track, as you said, Mitch, continues to prevail.
And we're going to look at the next slide, which actually shows how things have been going along on that front. Even back in March, wrong direction, wrong track was higher, but it was closer. I mean, we were looking at 52% versus 42%. That gap has continued to widen, which can't be good news for anyone who is responsible for whether we're on.
Yeah, this is always a bad sign for incumbents, obviously, and it's a sort of indicator that people look to see what the political climate is going to be in the upcoming election. But we generally are cynical, but as you say, there is some fluidity to the figures.
Yeah, and it certainly can become very interesting as time goes on. Let's go to another ballot issue, and that is the generic legislative ballot test. You're asking people if you are going to vote for a generic candidate. Right. We know we don't have them, but if you're going to vote for a generic candidate, would it be the Republican or the Democrat? And I guess surprising to some who followed this for years and years, Republicans have a pretty significant edge this time around, 48% going for the Republican candidate, 41% for the Democratic candidate. But we see from the last time that this question was asked the numbers for both have dropped a little bit.
Yeah, this is a response to the national environment. People are projecting their sort of discontent with the national, which is effectively a democratic regime, into state legislative races. I think that tends to be what's going on, and you'll see that with the generic congressional ballot, which I think you're going to ask me about in a minute. But it is a warning sign for the incumbent party in Washington. And that it tends to be looked at by a lot of people who follow these things a year ahead, because you don't have actual candidates you can ask questions about. So you do ask the generic. It's not always the greatest indicator, but it does have some predictive properties that we should pay attention to.
Yeah, and it's certainly things will become much more clear when there are real candidates.
Yep.
When we know what the maps actually are, we think we know.
Right, I didn't mention that either.
Yeah.
Right, and that's particularly pertinent in state legislative races.
Actually, and also in congressional. And
Yes.
let's go ahead and look at that generic congressional ballot. The question, and regardless of how you would vote at the state level, if the 2022 general elections were held today and you had to make a choice, would you be voting for the Republican or Democratic candidate for Congress? Once again, nice advantage at this point for the generic Republican.
Right, and as I said here, you're not projecting because national views on your way you're going to vote in state legislative races, because this is the congressional ballot, but it's very similar, as we said, to the numbers in the state legislative generic ballot. But again, warning signs, and Democrats are openly concerned about this.
Let's go ahead now and go to favorability.
Yes.
This is the type of thing that is typically on the Civitas poll and is very important. This question, looking at the favorability of several key political figures in North Carolina, we see Governor Roy Cooper, Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, and also Attorney General Josh Stein, who at least some people are thinking is probably a leading contender to be the next Democratic gubernatorial candidate.
I think he thinks that as well.
That's right. Well,
to be honest with you, you're being polite about it.
That's right. Roy Cooper can't run again,
Right.
so there will be a new Democrat running this time around, and of course, a Republican will be different because Republicans haven't held a seat since Pat McCrory. So we find that with Governor Cooper, about 1-to-1.
Yeah.
Favorability versus unfavorability. Mark Robinson is in good shape in terms of favorability versus unfavorability, but still a lot of people who have no opinion or don't know who he is. Josh Stein, a little bit smaller gap than Robinson, but also more favorable than unfavorable. But he has an even larger percentage of people who don't know who he is.
Yeah, people, down underneath the governor on the Council of State, people just don't know very much. They've heard of the names, but they can't really attribute any behavior or action to those names, and so they often really don't know what to say. That's not the case with the governor, and as you can see, Governor Cooper there is sort of split in terms of his favorable and unfavorables amongst North Carolinians. It is interesting, though, and I'm sure you're going to ask me this as well, to compare him with President Biden and the way North Carolinians are judging his job, and I think you'll see that Cooper is doing better, at least against that benchmark, against the presidents.
Yeah, certainly. And we have seen him at times be in a good favorability position.
Now, better than now.
Better than now, but still not to the. Joe Biden is not dragging him down to Biden level.
No. North Carolinians, I think, are looking at the state in isolation here. And this, and even probably unaffiliated independent voters are sort of thinking, well, he's a Democrat, but he's kind of our Democrat, and we've had the capacity to mold the guy, and he's doing things that are more in tune with the views of North Carolinians in a way that presidents don't, because of the distance that they are from us and from the obviously much larger national constituency that they have.
Well, we briefly put up a very interesting slide on the heat map telling us who is most in support or in opposition to these various candidates and elected officials. I'll also point out that you have a chance to participate in this discussion if you would like to. You can submit your question via Facebook or YouTube. I'm monitoring the Facebook questions as we talk, and my colleague Brooke Medina is looking at the YouTube, so she will send me some questions via YouTube if you have any of them. I guess not terribly surprising. Roy
Right.
Cooper's popular among Democrats, unpopular among Republicans,
Yeah.
vice versa. You pointed out something I'd like you to talk a little bit more about. Roy Cooper probably has the advantage, but also for polling the disadvantage of having had to stake out opinions on issues that are going to make some enemies, whereas Robinson and Stein haven't necessarily had to do that.
Well, they've done it, I think, but they don't have to do it in a formal capacity or one that's as much under the microscope of the state media. And they can take sort of hypotheticals. I know they're both in elected office, and obviously the Attorney General and the Lieutenant Governor, particularly the Attorney General in North Carolina, has to make some decisions that have real sort of practical implications for the lives of the citizens of the state. But that's unlike the governor, who makes much more frequent, important decisions and ones that are more closely scrutinized.
And in fact, this Attorney General has taken some stances on politically polarizing issues, but you don't have to treat that job that way. Attorney Generals are often just the guys who fight crime and save Granny from the scam artists.
Right, which actually, there's been some research in the past about how the position is a useful one to springboard to the governorship, or to at least to run for governor, because you're able to take these sort of popular positions as a people's champion, or a champion of the state interest against these people who are ripping us off, or, as you said, threatening our grandparents, and so it has become across the country a useful springboard for that for a gubernatorial campaign. And because of that,
right? And in our own state, our current governor and previous governor Mike Easley,
they were both attorney generals. Yes.
Let's go to you. You already prefaced it. Joe Biden, his job approval, not looking too good. 39% approval, 57% disapproval at this point, and the numbers have gone up. Strong disapproval going up 2 percentage points. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so his nets are pretty bad. It's not really a North Carolina thing necessarily either. If you look at the president's approval ratings nationally, they have gone south. It is, again, not a good sign either for him or Democrats who are going to be on the ballot in 2022. It is very low by historical standards. Nationally, at least, and of course we don't have the long time series of statewide data on presidential approval, but nationally at least, Biden's approval ratings at this stage are the lowest that any president has been since we've really done this, which is since Truman, with the exception of Trump. Trump's were lower, but we know what happened to the Republicans in the 2018 midterms. So it's not a good sign, and it's interesting what is causing it. I think if you look at, and again, this is more nationally, but although the North Carolina figures, the North Carolina numbers, of course, track this, there really is a beginning of a perceptible decrease, particularly at the end of the summer. And what do you point to? Possibly the Afghanistan withdrawal, possibly the increased numbers of coronavirus infections, possibly an acceleration in inflation, maybe all of them, maybe other stuff as well. But it is interesting, and it is not good news, obviously, for the president and the Democrats.
Let's take a look at where those trends are going, because we do have a slide on that.
Yeah.
We see that early on he was close. It was within the margin of error. Now a little bit more to the disapproval, 18 points under.
One of the interesting things, and this will probably come up in some of our other commentary in a bit, Mitch, but one of the interesting things about presidential approval these days is that presidents tend to have higher floors and lower ceilings than they used to have. And a lot of that is because of the greater partisanship in the electorate. So people will say, regardless of what's going on, you know, this president, he's on my team, he's my guy, I like him, or he's on the other team, I dislike him. And because of the polarized nature of our country at the moment, that means it's really hard for presidents to get really high, but it's also very difficult for them to plumb some of the depths that we've seen some presidents have.
So a narrower band.
A narrower band, high, as I say, lower ceilings, higher floors.
Let's go back to Governor Cooper. We've already talked about him, but we've also talked about the job approval specifically for Governor Cooper. And It's worsened just slightly, but he
Yep.
has for a number of months been kind of in that 50-50 position. About as many people like him as don't.
Yeah.
And we've talked earlier about the fact that part of that may be because he's had to take some stands on issues that are going to make some enemies.
Right, right. And I think also, there is a sizable number of North Carolinians who might identify themselves as independents, as we call them, unaffiliated technically here, or moderate to conservative Democrats, who are very uneasy with what's going on nationally, and are not particularly favorable towards the National Democratic Party and therefore the president, but see Governor Cooper as a different kind of Democrat, perhaps ideologically more moderate or more in tune with the needs of the people of North Carolina. And that's what's sort of explaining that difference between his approval ratings and the president's.
We're going to look at the trend line, and we could see that way back in May, he was doing very well, 12 points above water, 53-41. Now more in that kind of 1-to-1, as many people like him as don't like him. Probably not a huge effect on his political career because
he's a lame duck.
He's a lame duck, and we haven't heard any indication that he's wanting to run for anything in Washington, D.C. at this point. But do you think that this affects how he operates over the next couple of years?
Plausibly. Certainly the reaction that he'll get in the General Assembly, and of course a lot of that will depend on what happens in the 2022 midterms and what the lineup is like for those last 2 years of the second Cooper term. And naturally he's a conservative guy in a temperamental sense, right. So he's never had a huge agenda. And he's getting some things done at the margins, as we see with the budget agreement just this week, that it can do it with the Republicans in the General Assembly as well. It's hard to know what exactly he wants to do, so that any kind of deterioration in his numbers, which we see here, are going to have a real meaningful effect on his accomplishments at the end of the 2 terms. One thing would be if those numbers really go south and the Republicans' majorities in the General Assembly grow markedly for the last 2 years. That may have significant effect and will really put him on, obviously, in a defensive position rather than one sort of trying to move forward.
Well, it's certainly a situation I know that he and his team are monitoring very closely.
Yes.
We're going to move now past the political horse race items and get to some questions that deal with the economy. And so I think the first one is, how would you describe the current state of the American economy? And I guess the bottom line word for the majority is bad.
Yes.
You look at very bad or somewhat bad, it's at 64%. Those who think it's really good or somewhat good, only 31%. That can't be good news to anyone.
Well, certainly not incumbents, and certainly not Democrats who obviously Governor Cooper and then control Washington. It does sort of mirror the right track, wrong tracks. There's a lot of research that shows the state of the economy kind of feeds into that question quite a lot. It also feeds into approval ratings of executive office holders, particularly presidents, governors. It is interesting, though, why it would be so low, because a lot of the indicators are pretty good coming out of the coronavirus pandemic. The one negative indicator is inflation. That's an interesting one as well, because we're so unused to living with inflation.
And we're going to have an inflation question coming up to it.
But unemployment, other macroeconomic indicators tend to be are fairly positive. So it is interesting that we have such a low figure with regards to the economy.
And I wonder how much of this is also has some partisan edge to it as well, because when you look in the subgroups here, Democrats and black voters both flip. They actually are saying that they think by a more than 50% margin that the economy is in good shape.
Yeah, and this is an example of how much partisanship has permeated our thinking about things. Now, there's an interesting question. I don't know if you can ask me about shortages, but here's another example. Is the economy good? It is if my guy's in charge. the economy is bad if the other team is in charge, regardless of any material change in economic conditions. And that, again, that just demonstrates how much partisanship drives our views these days, or the views of a predominant number of voters.
And we've said that the voters think the economy is bad, and things are only getting worse, according to our next slide. The question was overall, do you think the economy is getting better or worse? 30% better, 65% worse.
Yeah, and again, that's again, you know, that's the partisan thing, but there are more people. The worse is higher than it is bad now, right? And the better, I think, is the same or a little bit lower than what it is now. So going forward, the projections are relatively gloomy, which is interesting when what actually, you know, compared to the very recent past, they clearly are getting better because the pandemic just shut everything down. And so if you look at indicators like employment rate or you look at, you know, growth, those are pretty strong, at least in the near-term future. So it is interesting, but again, it's not good for anybody who's in charge, and that's largely the Democrats, of course.
You've already mentioned unemployment and inflation, and we have a question that puts those two against each other.
Yeah.
Which do you feel is a more important problem facing the United States today, unemployment or inflation? Far and away, inflation is the one that gets it, 77% compared to 20% for unemployment. To me, that feeds back to what you were just saying, is that there's so many Americans who are not used to living with any level of inflation.
Right, and I think genuine, I am. I mean, I don't know if you are, but I've seen it. I mean, I've experienced it in my daily life, particularly when you go to the grocery store. But also, I think it's getting a lot of media attention because this is a fairly novel story. I mean, you know, for you and I, well, me particularly, and I'm sure some of our, you know, remember the late 1970s, early 1980s, which is really the last time that we experienced meaningful inflation. So there's a lot of media attention on inflation at the moment. And, you know, actually, there's a lot of media attention on the fact that the unemployment number itself is not particularly low. It is pretty low. But there are a load of job openings. So you know, there can't be an unemployment problem because I go into my local restaurant and it says they're now hiring. And I hear about labor shortages all the time. So clearly, you know, if we do see economic problems, which many of us do, as the previous questions showed, it's on the inflation side of this and the unemployment, which is unusual for, you know, the last couple of decades or so.
And you talked earlier about how this is bad news for the incumbents, and our next question deals with that very issue. The question is, in your opinion, do you believe that the country will be better off or worse off by the end of Joe Biden's first term as president in 2 years? Once again, more bad news for President Biden, 53% worse off, only 38% better off, which is bad for a country when you hope that everything is always going to be moving in a better direction, whoever's in charge.
Yeah, and it feeds back into previous questions, but it is interesting that people are projecting forward to 2024, and obviously they're taking from their current position, but as we know, things change for the better or the worse fairly rapidly often, and I think it's hard intellectually to make that call. I think people are sort of, again, saying, how do I feel now? I'm not feeling very good, and therefore I'm going to project that position onto the way I think I'm going to feel in 2024 or January 2025.
Yeah, so looking ahead, as everyone does, with imperfect knowledge. We never have what we need. All right, we're going to move from the economy and now hit some issues that have to do with the news and how people get the news. So the first question that we asked on this front is, which of the following sources would you say is your primary source for news? We gave people a lot of options: national broadcast news, local broadcast news, cable, Facebook, Twitter, newspaper, talk radio, other websites, and then unsure. And basically, no real clear winner, but three options that got the most. National news, about a quarter of those answering. Other websites, so not the big media giants, but other websites was just behind at 24%, and then cable news, 22%, with local news down there at 10%.
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting finding here.
Yeah, and if you conflate the social media ones as well, you know, you see a a little bit more. It's interesting because if you look at national polls, social media is a source that people are increasingly saying they're getting their news from, particularly younger people, and we don't really see that here. But what is demonstrating is a very fractured media environment, which is very different, of course, from what we experienced prior to about 2000, when the national and local TV news would have been a much larger percentage. And this has all sorts of interesting ramifications, which we could spend an hour talking about. But it does, again, show us that, the media landscape is in flux and is incredibly complicated these days. And when, 20, 30 years ago, when you first got in the business, for example, it was a lot simpler.
It certainly was, and as a person who still gets a newspaper delivered every day,
I do.
Looking at the 5% newspaper kind of makes me shake my head. We're going to move to another question that had to do with the news, and this is, how confident are you that the mass media, like newspapers, TV, and radio, reports the news fully, accurately, and fairly? Not good news for the media on the 67% saying they're not confident, only 31% confident.
Yeah, it goes to general cynicism that we see in the right track, wrong track, in the economy, with things in general, particularly institutions like the media. But it also speaks, I think, to partisanship. So again, you'll see that generally, although there is conservative mass media, generally, ideologically and by partisanship, conservatives and Republicans tend to have much less confidence than do Democrats and liberals.
And we're going to move to the next question on this, and that is looking at our local news first. In general, do you think that your local news and media are too liberal, just right, too conservative? Some say too liberal, 40%. Only 9% say too conservative. About 30% say just right. Does that surprise you at all?
No. Again, the media is seen as skewed to the left. Even, in fact, research shows even many liberals and progressives say that. As many as conservatives do, but there's a general perception. But our local news, we don't think quite so badly of them, mainly because they're kind of our men and women who we know, they're in our community.
You might see them. They might talk to you at some point.
Exactly, and so you know them personally, but also because a lot of the content tends to be less political. So there's a lot of, crime, entertainment, sports, as opposed to the national news, which tends to be a little harder. So I think that explains why, compared to national media, we tend to think our local media is a bit less biased and a little less ideological.
And that shows up in the next question, which is on the national news.
Exactly.
In general, do you think that your national news and media are too liberal or too conservative? Here, higher, 50% of too liberal, 11% too conservative, 22% just right. My guess is the people who just right are the ones who like exactly the news that they're consuming.
Right, yes.
Otherwise, you're going to find a skew one way or the other. Okay, well, let's now move on to another topic that's of interest. And you were telling me before we started, you found some of the questions in this area to be particularly interesting.
Yeah.
These are questions having to do with food. Let's go to the first one. This is a question: when going to your local grocery store this year, have you noticed a shortage of meat, dairy, or eggs? And before we talk about the results of this, it's another opportunity to remind everyone that if you have questions about the poll, about our analysis, feel free to jot them on the Facebook page for the John Locke Foundation or on YouTube if that's the way you're watching. We will be happy to answer once we get through all of the questions and give us our best attempts to answer them. So back to the question, when going to your local grocery store this year, have you noticed a shortage of meat, dairy, or eggs? 61% yes, only 33% no. That's hitting people right in the pocketbooks.
Well, yeah, I think people see it. I've seen it. The question is, this year, it's getting better, I think. I mean, I don't know whether people are perceiving that, but we've seen it, at least in the year. I mean, this is not Soviet shortages, right? These are relatively okay, but you see gaps on the shelves.
Right. Yeah, it certainly was true not too long after the COVID
Yes,
shutdowns.
which technically, of course, was last year, but I think people have noticed it in the recent, and that's what they're saying. But what I think is particularly interesting in this question, and I don't know if you've got it on the slide, but I saw it in the crosstabs, Mitch, is that it's highly partisan. So Republicans tend to say, I've seen shortages, and Democrats tend to say they haven't. Now, that makes no sense.
Right.
I mean, presumably
Everyone
you're
would
shopping
see
in
the
the
same
same, yeah, and you're probably, I mean, you know, there is a lot of, there's research to even show that some, obviously, cultural tastes are different between Democrats and Republicans. Might be more Democrats in Whole Foods.
Right.
Maybe Whole Foods shelves are better
Well
stocked
stocked, yeah.
than Harris Teeter or whatever, but clearly that's not really what's happening here. What people are saying is, the other, you know, Republicans saying the other guys are in charge, and I don't like this situation. And yes, because and they're more sensitive, perhaps, to seeing shortages or to say yes, there's shortages, this thing's terrible. And Democrats, of course, doing the opposite.
Yeah, very interesting how party labels and party views
Has
affect
really
almost everything.
pervaded a question
That's
like
right.
this, which should be not political at all.
We're going to go now to something, this is kind of interesting, where your food is produced. Some people are concerned about where the food they eat is produced, while others say the production location doesn't matter to them. When you purchase food or beverages, how often do you look at the labels to find the country or state in which they were produced? And, you know, interesting, 36% very often. If you combine the very often and somewhat often, it's well over 60%.
Yeah.
As a person who never checks, I
Same
find
with
this
me.
fascinating.
So I don't say never check. So, you know, but it does say how often and very often. I mean, you know, I might put myself, even though I'm probably a never, I might sort of say I'm not very often. But yeah, these numbers are pretty high. I don't know whether there's social desirability effects here, where people are saying, I probably should be, I'm not, but maybe I'll tell the interviewer, you know, or I'll put on the survey that I do. But I did find that surprising. I don't really have an answer to that.
And you and I both fit in this category, but it was voters 50 plus who were more likely. And I was like, well, okay,
Yeah.
well.
I don't know whether they just have more time to do so than many retirees. But again, I don't know if you're going to show me this, but on the crosstabs, you do actually see not as much as you did on the shortages, because this doesn't seem to be a reflection on the government, right? But it is slightly more that Republicans and conservatives will do the often, very often. And I was trying to think a little bit about why. I don't know whether it's a little bit because Republicans have become increasingly protectionist on trade, largely as a function of Trump, whereas in the past there weren't those partisan differences. And so, you know, thinking more nationalistically, primed by the Trump years, Republicans are a little bit more into that. I don't know. That's just speculation, but that's as a possible explanation.
We also asked some questions about the sourcing of the food and what people thought about that. So a question is, how important is it to you that the produce you eat is sourced from farms in the United States rather than from farms in foreign countries? A lot of people.
Yeah, and that's even more that local thing. Of course, on the left, culturally, there's a lot of this grow local, consume local. It's a lot of environmental stuff, and so there's a lot of people on the left who think that's important as well, not for nationalistic, but for environmental reasons. And I think there are people like, I don't want my milk coming from somewhere else, because what's it going to be like? Right. When I consume it, it travels that far. It's going to be off, you know. So I think that makes complete sense to me. Those figures.
The interesting thing on this national question, whether you want it in the U.S., is it's 85% who say they want their food from the U.S., but the sentiment dips significantly among 18 to 34-year-olds, which I find interesting, and the majority still indicated it's important, but 34% of them disagreed, compared with 14% of the overall.
Yeah, I guess in preparing for this, I hadn't really looked at that and thought about it, but that is interesting. I don't know whether if that feeds to the fact that younger people tend to be more on the sort of globalization rather than localization side of cultural changes and political changes in recent years. They're less sensitive to national boundaries. But that might have something to do with it.
It could be interesting. And then the follow-up question to that is, how important is the food being sourced from North Carolina? and they're still high, although
Yeah.
just a little bit lower. I'm guessing there's some people who thought, well, yes, if it's from the U.S., it should be from North Carolina too.
Yes. Yeah. And again, a lot of this is the sense that, if it's local, it doesn't have to travel so far, it's probably fresher, right? And therefore, yes, I would like it to be.
Well, let's move on from food. I'm sure a lot of you out there are waiting to get to your food, so you're wanting us to wrap up. Let's talk about some of the constitutional amendments. But I have to say the first one that we're going to talk about is about food.
Yeah.
This is a question. Would you support or oppose an amendment to the North Carolina Constitution to declare that all individuals have a natural, inherent, and unalienable right to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume the food of their own choosing for their own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being? That's a long amendment, but I think it tracks the one that
in Maine. There was one in Maine that passed. Earlier this month.
75% support for that. Only 6% opposition. 11% neither. 8% unsure. That's pretty strong support.
I got two things to say. First of all, everybody likes rights, and you put something about you have a right to do something in a question. People say you're right. Damn right, I do have a right. I mean, and so that's very attractive, obviously, and I think is explaining some of these. As a practical matter, though, if this were to be put on the North Carolina, on a ballot for North Carolinians to vote on, the whole debate that plays out is going to be very important in determining whether it passes or not. Here, you look at these figures and say there's no chance that it's going to fail, but my sense is that there will be a lot of opponents. So for this, it will be your neighbor can have a pig farm in his backyard, right? Or this means if people can do this, they can do anything with their house, right? We have these standards in subdivisions, and and it affects our property value. Those kinds of things will come into a debate. There will be opponents who will be organized, funded. It will be talked about in the media, and so I would suggest that people don't project those numbers onto a final outcome if this was really to be put on the ballot, because I think it's going to be a very different way it's going to be talked about.
For those of you who don't know, our expert analyst is from the United Kingdom, and the reason I bring that up is this discussion reminds me a little bit of a show that was on in the 70s, and I had a couple different names. I know it under the name Good Neighbors, where the guy decided he was going to...
Richard Bryant, and Felicity Kendall. Yeah,
he was
The Good Life, it was called in
Good Life. He was going to leave his corporate job and become completely self-sustainable, and much of the discussion in the show was about how that was affecting everyone else.
Yes.
Because he was growing his own food.
A rooster gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning and wakes everybody up with its crowing. Yeah, I mean, that's the way it's going to be framed. We've seen a little bit of this locally in Kerry, for example. It's good. I don't know if people remember the Kerry chicken dispute in recent years where people were trying to get Kerry to change its rules so that they can have chickens in their yards. That's the kind of argument that's going to happen if that is to be put on the ballot.
And interesting in the crosstabs, the majority support holds among all key voter groups, but it dips a little bit in Raleigh-Durham, where you probably think, okay, people
I don't
more
need
closely
it. I live in an
together.
apartment. How am I going to do this?
And among Democrats, black voters, college-educated voters, and high-income voters. I'm guessing the high-income voters say, no, you're not going to have that pig in the backyard when you live next to me.
Yeah.
So very interesting. Let's move to another constitutional amendment that actually has been put forward as a piece of legislation, though not voted on anywhere.
Yes.
And that is, would you support or oppose an amendment to the North Carolina Constitution to prohibit the state and its political subdivisions from discriminating or granting preferential treatment on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment, public education, or public contracting? This is basically taking out quotas or the race-based admissions to the university.
Affirmative action programs.
69% support, 15% opposition, with 7% neither and 9% unsure.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think, and if actually, again, I don't know if you're going to show this, but the numbers are pretty high amongst Democrats and African Americans as well. Two groups that you would think would be much more supportive of affirmative action, which this is against.
Right.
But people are very uncomfortable with racial preferences, even people who are supposedly benefiting from them. I mean, that's the way. We don't like that. We don't like racism. We don't like reverse racism. We like people to be treated equal. And I think that's getting at that sentiment. And for people who are interested in trying to, kind of revise or amend or even repeal completely affirmative action policies, it is interesting to note that there are people, again, who supposedly benefit from them, who are sympathetic to that and who really would like to get to that stage. So this is good, I think, good news in a way that the other constitutional amendment, the data, I think should be with a large asterisk for the yes position on the previous question. I think this is more genuinely good news for the yes position should this question be brought up and taken to the voters.
This amendment gets majority support across all the key voter groups.
Yes.
Voters 50 plus, those on the coast, Republicans, and low-income voters have the highest number in opposition. So an
Yes.
interesting group. Not all groups that you would say always are on the same page together.
Right.
I'm wondering on this particular one whether you think some of the support, maybe even a few percentage points here and there, has to do with all of the discussion we've had lately about critical race theory and the teaching in schools that some groups are more responsible for the problems that we've had. And that feeds
obviously, the last couple of years, with the clear exception of the coronavirus pandemic, race and race relations have been up there as maybe number 2, number 3 issue. We've been primed to think about them because of a variety of different events and stories. And I think people are uncomfortable and they naturally, as Americans, we don't like racial differences. And I think that's being reflected in the responses to this question.
We've gone through the slides fairly quickly and have a little bit more time. I don't have any questions at this point on Facebook, but you still have a little bit of time if you'd like to submit one. Go to the John Locke Foundation's Facebook page, or if you're watching on the John Locke Foundation's YouTube page, you can write a question there, and my colleague Brooke Medina will send it our way. I'm refreshing my phone just in case, and right now I haven't seen any. But while we're waiting at least a couple minutes for potential questions, in looking at this in general, what was the first thing that came to your mind about, oh, this is something we need to pay attention to going forward?
Well, I think, the first few questions that we talked about as sort of indicators, early indicators of what 2022 might look like are obviously clear here and important to talk about. So Biden's approval rating, generic ballot questions, don't look good for Democrats. That's not totally unusual for the in-party, the governing party, but the numbers are pretty bad relative to other recent data points that we have. What does that mean for 2022, though? Well, particularly in Congress, it could mean the chambers flipping, both or one.
And right now, Democrats have very small margins.
They have, 6 seats in the House, and it's tied in the Senate. It's only the Vice President, of course, breaks the tie. Because the trouble with the U.S. Senate is that the arrangement of seats, only a third of the seats are up, so it depends on what states they're in. And the lineup doesn't look great for Democrats, but it could be worse of the states that are up. North Carolina, of course, is one such race that both parties are looking very carefully at because it's an open seat with Senator Burr's retirement. So that's certainly one thing. I really enjoy looking at the partisan and ideological responses to questions that don't seem related to politics at all. We mentioned that with the shortages question. I think this kind of stuff is really interesting. A lot of political scientists are looking at these kinds of things. Why do people have such politically polarized views about matters that have nothing to do with politics? And you see, there even people in economics do a lot of this work, and marketing. Why do Democrats shop so and so? Why do they drive these cars? Why do Republicans do this? Why do Republicans like country music and Democrats, not? Or why do the Democrats drive Volvos and Republicans don't? These are really interesting things, and they do demonstrate how pervasive political views have become in our lives. So that's really interesting. And then I like the constitutional amendment stuff because I like the framing stuff. I really do find that food one particularly interesting, the right to grow one's own food, because I think it's framed in such a way to solicit those kinds of response immediately when people haven't thought about this kind of issue. But if you put it in a campaign where the media's covering it, where both sides are heavily funded, and respondents have a lot more information about how it would work in practice, I suspect we're going to be a lot more polarized, and it's going to be a lot more evenly split.
And I think perhaps on that one, it might not really get into a partisan divide.
No, it won't be partisan, but it will be evenly split. I do. And you mentioned with some of the crosstabs. Yeah, I do. I suspect, for example, take an average sort of conservative. The freedom thing is really pulling them in a yes direction, but then thinking about the practical applications, maybe in terms of their life and their personal lives and the property values, and it might be pulling them in a different one, and similarly for liberals and as well in different ways. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily going to be partisan or ideological one, but I do think the way it's framed in a sort of hypothetical question, compared to how it would play out in a campaign, it's going to be completely different.
So I also have to ask you, because we know that the politicians, some of them will be looking at this poll, they're doing their own polls. They're not just going to sit back and say, oh no, people don't like these things. They're going to change what they do, the policies they put forward, the ideas that they have in response to bad polling. Do you think that there's a likelihood that we're going to see things tighten up on some of these horse race issues over the course of the next year as the incumbents or the Democratic Party, if they're the ones who are looking at this and seeing bad news, if they switch gears, are they going to search as hard as they can for something that's going to be the winning message?
Yeah, no, this is raising, and it's not just the North Carolina numbers. Obviously, these are replicated across the country. These are ringing alarm bells for Democrats. There's a lot of sort of introspection at the moment, questioning what's going on. Is it because we've not produced? There's been a lot of media coverage. The sort of normal, regular infrastructure bill, as I often call it, is now law. But the Build Back Better, the social change, climate change infrastructure bill is not. There's a lot of wrangling over the price tag. Democrats might get something, I think they will get something done there, but it's not going to be what many of them want. So they're asking, should we get things done? Do we need to tack to the center a bit more? Obviously, a lot of people on the left are saying no. These numbers make them have this kind of debate because they understand it's a reflection on their governance, and it's the public's way of sort of saying you're not doing a particularly good job, or the job we want you to do at this point in time. But it's the generic ballot, right? And it's also the presidential approval. And of course, the president's not on the ballot in 2022, and we don't vote for parties. We vote for people who represent parties, and sometimes the actual names in those slots change the way we think about the party label. So we don't have candidates yet, and that's going to be very important as well in determining the outcomes in 2022.
Well, one way I know that your analysis has been expert is that there are no questions. Everything, everything has been explained well. People know exactly what we're talking about. So I think we'll take this opportunity to wrap things up. Any final thoughts about what we should take away from this poll?
No, I think we've covered it. Again, those last 3 points about the warning signs for Democrats, about how pervasive political orientation, ideology, partisanship now is in shaping our views about just about anything. And then that fun stuff with the amendments there, and the idea of framing, how you frame issues in a low information environment, which is the food question now. Not so much the affirmative action one, because people do have views of that, but the food one. And then how it might be framed when people get their hands on it and try to feed us a lot of information pro and con.
I suspect that if that particular amendment gets on the ballot, a lot of people will be looking at Maine and seeing what happened there.
Exactly,
What
and
worked,
it did pass in Maine.
yeah, what worked, what didn't work,
Yes.
how do you go about that?
And hopefully watch this,
exactly.
the recorded version of this conversation, because I think we've got some insight for both sides.
Yes, we have been, if this does come to pass, we will have been prescient.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Dr. Andrew Taylor is professor of political science at North Carolina State University and always a welcome guest on the Civitas poll presentation. My name is Mitch Kokai. I believe that lock President Donald Bryson is likely to be back in this seat again. He's the one who really finalizes the poll questions and keeps the closest tabs on this. So you feel free to submit any questions to Professor Taylor or to me, or to Donald Bryson, especially if you have some ideas about things you would like to see polled in the future. But for now, we're going to wrap up this Civitas poll presentation. Thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you'll enjoy the rest of your day.